The many faces of narcissism. Why one size fits all doesn't work. What if the most dangerous narcissist you will ever meet is not loud, arrogant, or cruel in obvious ways? What if they never raise their voice, never brag, never dominate a room? Yet somehow, over time, you feel smaller, quieter, and less like yourself? For many people, the word narcissist immediately brings to mind a specific image: the flashy ego, the relentless self-promotion, the person who seems obsessed with mirrors and applause. That image is comforting, because it makes narcissism feel easy to spot. And when something is easy to spot, it feels safer. But here's the uncomfortable truth that shocks most survivors when they finally see it clearly. Not all narcissists look like narcissists. Some of them look wounded, some of them look humble. Some of them look like the most selfless person in the room. And that is exactly why so many people stay trapped for years, quietly asking themselves a question that slowly corrodes their sense of reality. If this is abuse, why does no one else see it? In real life, narcissism is not a personality costume someone wears all the time. It is a pattern of emotional survival, a set of strategies designed to protect a deeply fragile inner world. At its core, narcissism is not about loving oneself too much. It is about not being able to tolerate feeling insignificant, unsafe, or unseen, and needing other people to regulate those feelings instead. This is where the one-size-fits-all myth collapses. Some narcissists regulate their inner chaos by being admired. Others do it by being needed. Some do it by being feared. Others by being morally superior. The behavior changes, the mask changes. The impact, however, is often the same: confusion, self-doubt, emotional exhaustion, and a gradual erosion of your sense of self. Take a moment and consider this. How many times have you tried to explain a relationship to someone else only to stop mid-sentence because the words didn't sound convincing out loud? How many times did you think, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I'm the problem? That internal collapse doesn't happen in healthy relationships. It happens when your reality is repeatedly overridden by someone else's emotional needs. In the United States especially, narcissism often hides behind socially rewarded roles. The charismatic leader, the self-sacrificing parent, the devoted helper. The sensitive partner who just feels things deeply. When these roles are reinforced by culture, family systems, workplaces, or communities, the narcissistic behavior doesn't just go unnoticed, it gets protected. And the person being harmed learns a dangerous lesson. Silence is safer than clarity. Understanding narcissism, then, is not about diagnosing people or labeling them as villains. It's about learning to recognize patterns instead of personalities. It's about noticing how you feel in someone's presence, how often your needs disappear, and how quickly your boundaries turn into guilt. It's about trusting the quiet signals from your body and nervous system long before your mind has the language to explain them. This matters because awareness is not cruelty. Awareness is orientation. It is the moment the fog starts to lift. When you realize you were not weak, broken, or naive, you were adapting to a system that required you to shrink so someone else could feel whole. In this series, we are going to explore the many faces of narcissism. Some obvious, some subtle, some deeply unsettling. Not to scare you, but to give you clarity. Because clarity is where power returns. If this perspective already feels like it's touching something personal, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel and support this work. These conversations aren't easy, but they are necessary. And your support helps make more honest, healing content possible. Before we continue, here's a quick question for you. Which feels more familiar in your experience? A. The narcissist in my life was loud, dominant, and obviously controlling. B. The narcissist in my life was quiet, wounded, or subtly manipulative. Comment A or B below. Your answer matters more than you might realize, and it may help someone else feel less alone. The core 4. Grandiose, malignant, vulnerable, and communal narcissists. Once you understand that narcissism does not have a single face, the next question naturally arises. If they're not all the same, then how do they actually differ? This is where many people feel both relief and grief. Relief because patterns finally start to make sense, and grief because clarity often confirms what the heart has been sensing for a long time. At the center of narcissism are 4 core expressions. They are not rigid boxes, and real people often move between them. But each type leaves a distinct emotional imprint on the people closest to them. If you listen closely to that imprint, you can often recognize which pattern you're dealing with. The grandiose narcissist is the one most people expect. This is the version the world recognizes and disturbingly often rewards. They appear confident, decisive, even inspiring. They dominate conversations effortlessly and seem to radiate certainty. When Emily first met Daniel, this side occasionally showed itself in public settings. He was articulate, engaging, and seemed to know exactly who he was. Others gravitated toward him. Compliments followed him easily. But the emotional cost of a grandiose narcissist is subtle at first. Over time, the people around them begin to feel like supporting characters. Achievements are minimized, needs are sidelined, and any challenge to their authority, no matter how gentle, feels to them like betrayal. The grandiose narcissist doesn't just want admiration, they need it to stabilize their inner world. Without it, irritation, contempt, or rage often surface. Then there is the malignant narcissist, a far darker expression. This is where narcissism intersects with cruelty. Malignant narcissists do not merely seek validation, they seek dominance. Control itself becomes the reward. While not every narcissist is malignant, those who are leave deep psychological wounds behind them. Empathy is absent, manipulation is strategic, and other people's pain may even be satisfying. This type is often easier to identify because the harm is more visible. Fear replaces confusion. Self-doubt turns into hypervigilance. Relationships with malignant narcissists are less about emotional erosion and more about survival. While Daniel did not fully embody this pattern, Emily occasionally saw flashes of it, moments where her distress seemed to register not as concern but as inconvenience. The vulnerable narcissist is the one most likely to be misunderstood. They appear insecure, anxious, or emotionally fragile. They may speak openly about their pain, their trauma, or how misunderstood they feel. Daniel often fell into this role at home. When Emily tried to express her needs, his response wasn't anger, it was collapse. He withdrew, became despondent, or framed himself as deeply wounded. The vulnerable narcissist still centers themselves, but they do it through helplessness rather than dominance. Entitlement hides behind sensitivity. Their suffering becomes the gravitational force around which everyone else must orbit. Over time, partners like Emily stop expressing needs altogether, not because they don't have them, but because doing so feels cruel. Finally, there is the communal narcissist, one of the most disorienting forms. Communal narcissists define themselves as good, moral, helpful, or spiritually evolved. They are the caregivers, the volunteers, the pillars of their communities. From the outside, they look admirable. Sometimes they genuinely believe in this identity, but the harm occurs privately. Their goodness becomes a shield against accountability. Any criticism is framed as ingratitude. Any boundary becomes proof that you are selfish. In subtle ways, Emily felt this too. Daniel often spoke about how much he gave, how deeply he cared, how exhausting it was to be so emotionally available. Meanwhile, her own emotional labor went unnamed and unseen. What unites all four types is not ego but emotional extraction. Each one in their own way pulls regulation, validation, or identity from others instead of developing it internally. And the people closest to them slowly pay the price, not always with dramatic blow-ups but with quiet self-abandonment. Recognizing these patterns is not about condemning someone. It is about finally understanding why love felt so heavy, why communication never resolved anything, and why being understanding kept costing you more of yourself. When you can name the pattern, you stop fighting ghosts. You start seeing the structure of the cage, and once you see it, you can begin to imagine life beyond it. Overt versus covert narcissists, loud control versus silent manipulation. One of the most destabilizing realizations for people trying to understand narcissism is this: harm does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it cries, sometimes it waits until no one else is watching. And this is where the distinction between overt and covert narcissists becomes life-changing. Overt narcissists control through visibility. Covert narcissists control through invisibility. When people imagine narcissistic abuse, they often picture shouting, insults, public humiliation, or obvious domination. That image fits the overt narcissist. Overt narcissists are direct. They assert power openly. They interrupt, belittle, intimidate, or demand. Their entitlement is visible, and their reactions to boundaries are explosive or contemptuous. If you disagree with them, you know it immediately. If you disappoint them, they let you feel it. In relationships with overt narcissists, the damage is often obvious to outsiders. Friends may say, "Why do you put up with that?" Co-workers may witness the arrogance. Family members may see the tension in the room. The pain is real, but at least it has a name. You are not constantly questioning whether it exists. Covert narcissists, on the other hand, rarely look abusive. They look wounded. They look misunderstood. They look like the person who just needs more reassurance, more patience, more compassion. Their control does not come from force, but from emotional gravity. This was the version of narcissism that shaped Emily's daily life with Daniel. Daniel did not yell. He did not insult her openly. In public, he was attentive and soft-spoken. People described him as thoughtful, even sensitive. But at home, something didn't align. When Emily expressed a need, Daniel didn't argue, he withdrew. When she set a boundary, he became quiet, distant, heavy with disappointment. When she tried to explain her exhaustion, he framed himself as the one being hurt. Nothing he did looked aggressive, and yet Emily found herself constantly managing his emotional state, choosing words carefully, timing conversations strategically, abandoning topics altogether to avoid the aftermath. Over time, she stopped asking herself what she felt and started asking what he could tolerate. This is the hallmark of covert narcissism. Power without fingerprints. Covert narcissists manipulate through implication rather than command, through size rather than threats, through emotional collapse rather than confrontation. They are masters of plausible deniability. If confronted, they don't say, "I control you." They say, "I'm just sensitive on autumn," or "I guess I'm too much for you," or "I didn't realize my feelings were such a burden." And suddenly, you're not talking about the original issue anymore. You're apologizing, you're reassuring, you're caretaking. One of the most painful aspects of covert narcissism is the loneliness it creates because from the outside, nothing looks wrong. When Emily tried to describe her relationship, she struggled to find evidence. There were no dramatic stories, no obvious villains, just a persistent feeling of shrinking, of being emotionally responsible for someone who never truly showed up for her. This is why covert narcissism is so often dismissed, or misdiagnosed as just insecurity. But insecurity alone does not systematically erase another person's needs. Insecurity does not punish boundaries. Insecurity does not require someone else to disappear so it can feel safe. The key difference between overt and covert narcissists is not intention, it is strategy. Both seek regulation through others. Both struggle with internal stability. But where overt narcissists dominate the space, covert narcissists occupy the emotional center of the relationship. Everything revolves around how they feel, what they can handle, and how close they are to collapse. If you have ever thought, "They're not mean, but I'm exhausted," you are not imagining things. If you have ever felt guilty for wanting basic reciprocity, you are not selfish. If you have ever wondered why asserting yourself feels cruel rather than healthy, you are likely dealing with silent manipulation rather than loud control. And here is the truth that brings clarity. Confusion is not a normal byproduct of love. Chronic self-doubt is not the price of intimacy. When a relationship consistently pulls you away from your own inner compass, it doesn't matter how gentle it looks on the surface. The impact is what defines it. Understanding the difference between overt and covert narcissism does not instantly solve the problem. But it gives you something essential back: language. And with language comes orientation. You are no longer lost inside the fog. You are beginning to see the shape of it. What they value most: somatic versus cerebral narcissists, and why it matters. Once you begin to recognize narcissistic patterns, another question quietly emerges beneath the surface. What is it that they are actually feeding on? Because while narcissists may share similar impacts on the people around them, the source of their sense of worth, the thing they cling to when their inner world feels unstable, can be very different. And understanding this difference is not intellectual. It is deeply personal because it often explains why you felt used in one specific way rather than another. Broadly speaking, narcissists tend to anchor their self-worth to one primary currency. For some, it is the body. For others, it is the mind. These are known as somatic and cerebral narcissists, and the distinction matters because it shapes how relationships slowly become unbalanced. The somatic narcissist organizes their identity around appearance, desirability, and physical validation. Their body becomes proof of worth. Beauty, youth, fitness, sexuality, and status symbols tied to the physical world are not preferences, they are lifelines. Admiration of the body is how they regulate shame. In Emily's relationship with Daniel, this showed up subtly. Daniel paid close attention to how they were perceived as a couple. Compliments directed at Emily made him glow at first, but later created tension. If someone praised her confidence or presence too strongly, his mood would shift. At home, he would withdraw or become critical in ways that felt disconnected from the moment. Emily couldn't understand why being admired felt like a liability rather than something to celebrate together. For somatic narcissists, partners are not fully separate people. They are extensions, reflections, mirrors. Your appearance, your desirability, even your vitality can feel threatening if it eclipses theirs. Over time, partners may find themselves dressing differently, shrinking their presence or downplaying their attractiveness, not because they are asked to, but because the emotional consequences of not doing so become too heavy. Cerebral narcissists, by contrast, attach their worth to intelligence, knowledge, and perceived superiority of mind. Their currency is insight, credentials, problem-solving, or being the smartest person in the room. Where somatic narcissists scan mirrors, cerebral narcissists scan conversations for opportunities to correct, explain, or subtly dominate. Daniel also moved in this space. In discussions, he positioned himself as the more emotionally aware, the more introspective one. When Emily tried to describe her experience, he reframed it through psychological language, explaining her feelings back to her in ways that subtly invalidated them. It wasn't aggressive, It sounded thoughtful, but it left her doubting her own perceptions. In relationships with cerebral narcissists, partners often lose confidence in their own thinking. They hesitate to speak. They second-guess their insights. Over time, they may defer automatically, assuming the other person knows better. The imbalance is not created by intelligence itself, but by the way intelligence is used to secure superiority rather than connection. What makes both somatic and cerebral narcissism so damaging is not what is valued, but how relentlessly it is protected. Any situation that threatens the narcissist's chosen currency becomes emotionally charged. A partner's success, confidence, or autonomy is no longer shared joy. It is competition. And competition in intimate relationships quietly erodes safety. In a culture saturated with social media, these dynamics are amplified. Somatic narcissists find endless validation through images, attention, and comparison. Cerebral narcissists find it through visibility, authority, and influence. The platforms change, but the hunger does not. For partners like Emily, the cost is often identity erosion. She began to ask herself questions she had never needed to ask before. Am I allowed to take up space? Am I wrong for wanting recognition? Am I too much or not enough? These questions do not arise in relationships rooted in mutual respect. They arise when one person's sense of self depends on the other person shrinking. Understanding whether someone is somatic or cerebral is not about categorizing them. It is about understanding the pressure points in the relationship, the places where you felt you had to disappear so someone else could feel whole. When you see that clearly, something shifts. You stop trying to win a game that was never meant to be fair, and you begin slowly to reclaim the parts of yourself that were set aside in the name of keeping the peace. The darker edges, sadistic and inverted narcissists, and the path back to yourself. At the far edges of narcissism are patterns that are harder to talk about, not because they are rare, but because acknowledging them forces a deeper truth into the light. Sometimes the harm was not accidental, and sometimes the role you played was never about weakness. It was about survival. Sadistic narcissism is where narcissistic traits intersect with the enjoyment of power over another person's pain. This does not always look like overt violence or cruelty. More often it appears as a quiet satisfaction when someone else feels confused, ashamed, or diminished. The sadistic narcissist feels regulated not just by control but by witnessing the emotional impact of that control. Discomfort becomes proof of dominance. Emily did not want to believe this existed in her relationship with Daniel, and for a long time she didn't have to. Most days his behavior fit more familiar patterns: withdrawal, fragility, subtle manipulation. But there were moments, especially during conflict, when something colder surfaced. When Emily finally broke down and named how small she felt, Daniel didn't comfort her. He became calm, detached, almost relieved. The intensity shifted from chaos to clarity, and she felt it in her body before she could explain it in words. That moment mattered. Because while not all narcissists are sadistic, when this edge appears, the emotional danger increases. The relationship stops being about misunderstanding and becomes about dominance. Repair is no longer the goal. Impact is. On the other side of this dynamic sits the inverted narcissist, a pattern that is often misunderstood and deeply stigmatized. Inverted narcissism is not about grandiosity. It is about self-erasure. These individuals organize their identity around attachment to narcissistic people. Their worth comes from being needed, chosen, or indispensable. They often feel safest in relationships where they are shrinking, fixing, or orbiting someone else's emotional gravity. Emily recognized herself here, painfully so. She was not controlling. She was accommodating. She anticipated Daniel's moods. She softened her needs. She carried responsibility for the emotional temperature of the relationship. When friends asked why she stayed, she didn't have an answer that made sense out loud. She just knew that leaving felt more dangerous than enduring. This is the core wound of inverted narcissism. Abandonment fear so deep that self-abandonment feels like protection. These patterns often trace back to early relational environments where love was conditional, unpredictable, or tied to performance. Over time, the nervous system learns a devastating lesson. If I disappear, I am safer. It is important to say this clearly. Inverted narcissism is not a character flaw. It is a trauma adaptation. The same is true for many narcissistic patterns themselves, but understanding the origin does not mean accepting the damage. The most confusing part for survivors is that narcissistic patterns rarely exist in isolation. Daniel was not one thing. He was vulnerable, covert, cerebral, and at times edged with something darker. This is why trying to diagnose someone often fails. Real people are fluid. What matters is not the label, but the impact. And the impact on Emily was unmistakable. She lost her internal compass. Her decisions revolved around emotional fallout. Her sense of self became conditional. None of this meant she was weak. It meant she adapted intelligently to an unsafe emotional system. The path back does not begin with confrontation. It begins with recognition. With the quiet realization that what you experienced had structure, that it wasn't random, that your responses made sense in context. Healing is not about becoming harder, it is about becoming clearer. It is about learning to tolerate the discomfort of disappointing someone without collapsing into guilt. It is about practicing boundaries not as punishments, but as declarations of self-respect. It is about rebuilding trust with your own perceptions, one small choice at a time. Emily's turning point was not dramatic. It was a moment of stillness when she realized that the anxiety she felt around Daniel was not love. It was vigilance. And love does not require vigilance to survive. If you see yourself in any of this, know this. Awareness is not cruelty. Distance is not abandonment. And choosing yourself does not make you selfish, it makes you whole. You were not broken, you were adapting, and now, with clarity, you are allowed to choose something different. Conclusion: Emily's story and what it teaches us about ourselves. Emily's story does not end with a dramatic confrontation, an exposed villain, or a perfectly clean escape. It ends the way most real stories do. Quietly, internally, with a shift in awareness. When she finally stepped back and looked at the entirety of her relationship with Daniel, she realized something both painful and liberating. Nothing was wrong with her. What felt like confusion was actually her intuition struggling to survive inside a system that required her to doubt herself. For years, Emily tried to be more patient, more understanding, more emotionally mature. She believed that if she could just explain herself better, love would feel lighter. But narcissistic dynamics do not dissolve with better communication because the problem was never a lack of words. It was a lack of reciprocity. Daniel's many faces, vulnerable, covert, cerebral, and occasionally darker, were not random. They were adaptive strategies that kept him regulated while slowly draining her. The most important lesson Emily learned is one that many people resist at first. Not every relationship can be healed through empathy alone. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. Compassion without self-protection turns into exhaustion. Love that requires you to disappear is not love. It is survival masquerading as devotion. For the audience watching or listening to this story, the application is not to immediately label someone in your life as a narcissist. The real takeaway is more grounded and more powerful. Start by observing patterns, not intentions. Ask yourself how you feel after interactions, not how reasonable the other person sounds. Notice where guilt appears the moment you assert a need. Pay attention to whether your nervous system feels calmer with distance or closeness. Healing begins when you stop asking, "Why are they like this?" and start asking, "What is this doing to me?" From there, change does not have to be dramatic. It can be as small as pausing before over-explaining, as quiet as honoring your discomfort, as brave as allowing someone else to be disappointed while you remain intact. Emily's growth was not about becoming harder or colder. It was about becoming clearer. And clarity is what allows you to choose relationships that feel mutual, safe, and expansive rather than confusing and heavy. Disclaimer.
This video is for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace professional diagnosis, psychological evaluation, or treatment from a licensed mental health professional. Before we end, here's a question for you. Which realization feels closer to your experience? I stayed because I believed love meant enduring discomfort. B. I stayed because leaving felt more frightening than staying. Comment or B below to share your answer. And now I'd love to hear from you. What part of Emily's story resonated with you the most? What insight did you take away, or what question are you still holding? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective too. If this content helped you feel seen or gave you clarity, please subscribe to the channel. Your support is what motivates us to continue creating deeper, more honest conversations about narcissism, trauma, and healing.